In July of 1863, the United States Army had just won the most important battle of the Civil War at Gettysburg. Within days, the Union's largest city was on fire, not from Confederate cannon, but from its own citizens turning on each other in 4 of the most devastating days of civil unrest in American history. This is the story of the New York City draft riots, a narrative about a law that let the wealthy purchase exemption from service, while working-class men were sent to face the front lines in their place. It is the story of how that single, glaring injustice escalated into a crisis so severe that Abraham Lincoln himself had to dispatch veteran troops, fresh off the fields of Gettysburg, to restore order in the streets of Manhattan. To understand how conditions deteriorated so rapidly, you have to understand the law that started it. By early 1863, the Union Army was facing a critical shortage of volunteers. 2 years of intense conflict had thinned the ranks, and fewer men were stepping forward. On March 3, 1863, Congress passed the Enrollment Act, establishing the first federal draft in American history. Every male citizen and every immigrant who had filed for citizenship between the ages of 20 and 45 was now eligible for conscription. On paper, it applied to everyone equally. In practice, it did not. Buried inside the law was a single provision that would ignite the city. Any drafted man could avoid service entirely, either by hiring a substitute or by paying the government a flat commutation fee of $300. $300 represented roughly a full year's wages for the average American laborer. For a wealthy merchant on Fifth Avenue, it was an inconvenience, an easy check to write. For an Irish immigrant dock worker in the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, it was an impossible sum, equivalent to everything he might earn in 12 straight months of hard labor. The message was not subtle, and New Yorkers understood it immediately. This was, as the phrase of the day put it, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. There was a second injustice layered on top of the first, one that would prove just as combustible. Black men living in New York were exempt from the draft entirely, because under the law of the time, they were not considered citizens. To many white immigrant laborers, already locked in fierce competition with black workers for the same low-wage jobs on the docks and in the factories, this exemption looked less like a technicality and more like a betrayal. In their eyes, a war fought over slavery was a conflict fought for black Americans at the direct expense of working-class white citizens, combined with the recent Emancipation Proclamation, which triggered fears that freed Southern laborers would soon flood north and undercut wages. The city was primed for unrest long before a single draft number was drawn. The first drawing of names took place on Saturday, July 11, 1863, at the offices of the Provost Marshal on 3rd Avenue and 47th Street. Remarkably, it passed without incident. Names were pulled from a lottery wheel, read aloud, and published in the following day's newspapers. But over Sunday, the one full day of rest between the first drawing and the second, anger simmered across the city's working-class neighborhoods. Opposing newspapers ran furious editorials. Angry crowds gathered on street corners, reading the published names of neighbors, friends, and family members, now bound for a conflict many of them wanted no part of. By Sunday night, the city felt less like it was preparing for a second day of routine bureaucracy, and more like it was bracing for a storm. At around 10 o'clock on Monday morning, July 13th, the storm arrived. A crowd of roughly 500 people, led in part by volunteer firemen from an engine company nicknamed the Black Joke, marched on the Provost Marshal's office, where the draft was scheduled to resume. Within minutes, the crowd smashed its way inside, destroyed the lottery wheel, tore apart draft records, and set the building ablaze. What began as an attack on a single office quickly became something much larger. The fire spread to neighboring buildings, and when city firefighters arrived, the rioters, several of whom were firemen themselves, blocked them from performing their duties. By early afternoon, an entire city block near the draft office had burned to the ground, and the crowd, now numbering in the thousands, was moving through the streets with no organized target and no central leadership. By midday, the focus of the crowd had begun to widen. Police officers who tried to intervene were assaulted in the streets. The mayor's official residence and the offices of pro-administration newspapers were targeted next, along with the homes of wealthy New Yorkers seen as supporters of the war. New York's police superintendent, John Kennedy, was recognized by rioters while trying to assess the situation near 5 Points, and was assaulted so severely that he was left in critical condition. For the police department, already stretched thin with many able-bodied officers away serving in the military, the events of that first afternoon made one thing brutally clear. They didn't have the manpower to contain what was unfolding. It was in the early afternoon of that first day that the unrest took its darkest turn, one that would come to define the entire event in American memory. The crowd's fury, which had begun as an attack on the machinery of an unfair draft, increasingly turned toward the city's black residents, who bore no responsibility whatsoever for the law that had sparked the anger. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, a mob descended on the Colored Orphan Asylum on Fifth Avenue, a home to more than 200 black children. The building was looted of nearly everything inside and set on fire. In one of the few moments of genuine courage during that terrible day, staff members, along with a number of sympathetic firemen and bystanders, worked quickly to evacuate every single child before the flames spread, and remarkably, all of them escaped safely. The building itself, however, burned to the ground, a physical symbol of exactly who the mob's anger had come to target. Over the following hours of that first evening, small groups broke off from the larger crowd and moved through black neighborhoods, and the violence in these encounters grew increasingly severe. Black New Yorkers were assaulted in the streets, and by the end of the first day, several had lost their lives. Word spread quickly through the black community that no part of the city was safe, and hundreds of families fled their homes that night, seeking whatever refuge they could find, in police stations, in churches, on ferries across the river, or hidden away in the homes of sympathetic neighbors willing to risk their own safety to shelter them. By the time night fell on Monday, July 13th, city officials understood they were facing an institutional crisis far larger than a single afternoon of unrest. Governor Horatio Seymour arrived in the city and addressed the crowds directly, attempting to calm tensions, but his message was seen by many as far too sympathetic to the rioters' grievances, and it did little to slow the escalating situation. Federal and city officials sent urgent telegrams to Washington requesting that troops be diverted from the front lines to restore order in the Union's own largest city. Tuesday, July 14th, brought no relief. If anything, the second day was more chaotic than the first, as the unrest fractured into dozens of smaller confrontations across the city rather than a single unified mob. Armories were stormed for weapons. Streetcar lines and telegraph wires were torn down to hamper communication and troop movement. Businesses that employed black workers or served a black clientele were targeted and destroyed, a deliberate effort by parts of the crowd to drive black New Yorkers out of entire neighborhoods and industries altogether. Police, reinforced by the small number of available military units in the city, fought pitched, block-by-block battles against rioters throughout the day, but remained badly outnumbered. We share these defining moments of American history weekly, working to preserve the voices and lessons of our past before they are lost to time. Subscribe today to join our community of history enthusiasts and help keep these vital narratives alive. By Wednesday, July 15th, the city had been without effective order for nearly 3 full days. The weather turned, bringing a heavy, sweltering rain that did nothing to cool tempers. Unrest that day spread even into Brooklyn, where grain elevators along the waterfront were set ablaze. In Manhattan, further targeted attacks on black residents were reported, underscoring just how thoroughly the crisis had transformed from a protest against an unfair law into an assault on an entire community that had nothing to do with righting it. That same day, in a desperate attempt to defuse the situation, the city's Common Council convened and voted to set aside $2.5 million in municipal funds, intended to cover the $300 commutation fee for any drafted New Yorker too poor to pay it himself. It was, in effect, a public admission of exactly what the crowds had been shouting for days, that the law itself had been unjust from the start. That evening, rioters clashed sharply with federal troops near 19th Street, but the tide of the unrest was about to turn. Reinforcements, hardened veterans, who had marched straight from the hallowed fields of Gettysburg, were finally arriving in the city. In the early hours of Thursday, July 16th, regiments including the famed 7th New York State Militia reached Manhattan after a forced march, bringing with them the discipline, numbers, and battlefield experience the exhausted police force simply did not have. Throughout that final day, these federal troops moved systematically through the city, retaking key intersections, bridges, and the last remaining pockets of organized resistance. A final confrontation took place that evening near Gramercy Park, where soldiers dispersed the last crowds. By midnight on July 16th, after 4 days that had brought the largest city in the United States to a virtual standstill, order had finally been restored. The human cost of those 4 days remains difficult to pin down with total precision, a reflection of just how chaotic and undocumented much of the violence truly was. The official published records listed approximately 120 fatalities, though some historians, examining hospital records, burial logs, and contemporary accounts, have argued the true number was significantly higher, possibly reaching into the hundreds when accounting for losses that went unreported amid the chaos. Property damage was estimated at roughly $1.5 million in 1863 currency, a figure equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today. Thousands of the city's black residents were left homeless, their homes, businesses, and places of worship destroyed, and many chose never to return to the neighborhoods they had fled, permanently altering the black community's presence in Lower Manhattan for decades to come. The Colored Orphan Asylum itself would eventually rebuild, not on its original site, where neighboring property owners objected to its return, but in a sparsely settled area to the north of the city that would later become known as Harlem. In the aftermath, the draft itself resumed only weeks later, in mid-August, this time conducted under the protection of thousands of federal troops stationed throughout the city to prevent any repeat of the crisis. The commutation fee that had ignited so much of the unrest remained in place for the remainder of the war, though the crisis prompted renewed public debate over its fundamental unfairness. In a striking coda to the entire episode, less than a year later, in March of 1864, New York City's first all-black volunteer regiment marched proudly through the very streets that had so recently seen black residents targeted and driven from their homes, cheered on by a crowd estimated at 100,000 people. A powerful, hard-won symbol that the city's story was not yet finished being written. The New York City draft riots remain, by most measures, the largest and most severe instance of civil unrest in American history, a sobering reminder of how quickly a single unjust law, layered onto existing tensions of class and race, can tear apart the fabric of even the most powerful city in the nation. It is a story with very few clean heroes, but it is not without moments of genuine courage. The staff and bystanders who rushed 200 children safely out of a burning orphanage. The neighbors who sheltered strangers at real risk to themselves. And a city that, however slowly and imperfectly, chose in the years that followed to keep moving forward rather than be permanently defined by its worst 4 days. This singular week completely redefined the fragile social fabric of the nation. If you found this look into New York's past compelling, share this video with a friend so you can discuss how these historical turning points still echo in our cities today.